B. Collins.
Peter B. Collins, news and comment. It's Friday, February 14th, 2020. Happy Valentine's Day to you and yours. Attorney General William Barr is a reliable Republican cover-up specialist. And he has dominated the news cycle the last 24 hours by posing as outraged that Donald Trump has tweeted instructions to him on how he should handle the sentencing of Roger Stone. And despite the public knowledge that Bill Barr did intervene, he ordered prosecutors to change the sentencing memo submitted to Judge Amy Berman Jackson. And he said he did all that without any guidance from the president, including Trump's tweets. But the timing appears much more than coincidental. And when you look at the history of Bill Barr and his operations at the Justice Department, he was a key figure in the cover-up of Iran Contra. And if you listen to our latest in-depth interview, which I'm releasing to subscribers today, you'll hear Nick Bryant, the guy who has courageously exposed child trafficking, sex rings involving powerful political figures, including some Republicans. And Nick Bryant says that Bill Barr is at it again, and we'll get to that in a moment. But today, Trump kind of split the difference. And while he didn't attack Bill Barr the way he does almost anybody else who goes sideways with Trump publicly, Trump quoted Barr in a tweet today saying that the president has never asked me to do anything in a criminal case. And Trump added that he has so far chosen not to interfere in a criminal case, even though he insists that he's not legally bound to do so. This doesn't mean that I do not have, as president, the legal right to do so. I do, but I have chosen so far not to. So he's saying that he can micromanage the Justice Department, even when the people involved in the cases where he intervenes are cronies of the Don, our would-be mob leader who operates with a mob mentality. So this assertion by Trump in the Voice of the New York Times implicitly rejected a request by Barr to stop tweeting about the department's cases. And they continue, it adds to the mounting controversy over the decision by senior Justice Department officials to overrule prosecutors who had recommended a 7 to 9 year sentence for Roger Stone, convicted of 7 felonies, and the subsequent resignation from the case of 4 prosecutors, 1 who decided to resign from the Justice Department altogether. And I'm sure you've heard Bill Barr feigning outrage and saying that the commentary from Trump, all these tweets, have made it impossible for me to do my job. He said, I'm not going to be bullied or influenced by anybody. Quote, I cannot do my job here at the department with a constant background commentary that undercuts me. But he continues to do the errands of the president, even as he objects to being publicly exposed, because he's old school, see? He's pre-Twitter. And he believes that you do these things with winks and nods and no paper trail, no public acknowledgement. Boom, it just happens and, people get over it. And so here is the latest development that belies Bill Barr's position. Today, the announcement that he has assigned an outside prosecutor to scrutinize the criminal case against Michael Flynn, who was Trump's first national security advisor. And as you know, I believe that the Mueller team went light on Mike Flynn, allowing him to plead guilty to lying to Peter Strzok when Strzok went to Flynn's office at the White House and confronted him over the wiretaps they had of his conversations with Sergei Kislyak, the Russian ambassador to the United States. If you're a regular listener, you know that I don't think that's a big deal. The lying is actionable, but what he did, I don't think was criminal. May have been ill-advised. He communicated with the ambassador before Inauguration Day. But again, if you're a regular listener, you know that I believe that Mike Flynn's $500,000 contract to promote the interests of Turkey while he was on the campaign staff of Donald Trump is a much more serious issue. All right, that aside, Barr appears to be angling to investigate the investigation of Mike Flynn in support of Flynn's call for a new trial. He has withdrawn his guilty plea, claims that he is a victim. And in this case, once again, this is something that Trump wants that Bill Barr is delivering. And is he also delivering for Trump and other figures who are implicated with connections to Jeffrey Epstein? Well, today I'm releasing a fresh in-depth interview. Nick Bryant is the guy who wrote the Franklin scandal about the 1980s case of kids from Boys Town who were being trafficked to political parties in Washington, D.C., and used by political figures in schemes that likely involve blackmail of those predatory politicos. Well, Nick Bryant points out that while Harvey Weinstein and Bill Cosby are predatory people, that the Epstein case involved minors, children, including girls as young as age 12. Here is Nick Bryant in an excerpt from our interview. That's reporter and author Nick Bryant. I encourage you to listen to the full interview. He is hopping mad that the enablers of Jeffrey Epstein are not even being investigated, much less prosecuted. And we talk about Ghislaine Maxwell, Epstein's one-time girlfriend who became his procurer and also participated in 3 ways with Epstein and underage girls. There appears to be no effort to even interview her, investigate her, much less indict her. And that's just one example. And we discuss how Donald Trump, Bill Clinton, Alan Dershowitz all show up with their names circled in the black book of Jeffrey Epstein that was managed by one of his associates. I think it was a pilot for the plane. And so I support Nick Bryant, and I signed on to his petition today at change.org. There's a link to it in the show file for the interview podcast, and I encourage you to sign your name to demand justice for the victims of Jeffrey Epstein. One of the other points that Nick Bryant tells us is, because I haven't talked to him in about 5 years, he has not written or published anything about Jeffrey Epstein, and he says part of that is that publishers don't want to touch him, and the other part is that he has been set back by a personal investigation of his finances by the Internal Revenue Service. And while he tries to avoid any thought that he might be paranoid, I think it's a legitimate concern that it was his reporting that caused the scrutiny by the IRS. And similarly, as we hear the news that a jury in New York has found Michael Avenatti guilty of attempted extortion of the Nike shoe company. This is the guy who was Stormy Daniels' attorney. He was all over cable news for a while. He was even discussed as a potential presidential candidate. I think he started that discussion. Now, this is a guy with a huge ego. But his threat to Trump by representing Stormy Daniels, I think it's fair to raise the question, was this prosecution in the Nike case selective and political? He's also accused of defrauding clients here in California. And he seems like a scumbag to me. I'm not going to start the free Michael Avenatti committee. But we do have to honestly ask if his prosecution just had a little bit to do with his irritation of the Big Don. A setback for Trump from the D.C. Appeals Court. A 3-judge panel has unanimously blocked the effort to link Medicaid benefits to work or job preparation by the beneficiaries. And in a ruling written by a Reagan appointee, they said, look, the case from Arkansas where there's some 11, do I have this right? 18,000 Medicaid recipients have lost their benefits since a work requirement was imposed there. This is enabled by a waiver granted by the Trump administration. There's a similar case in Michigan that's moving up in the courts. And this is a victory because an effort by Trump to rewrite the underlying Medicaid law and to insert a work requirement that was never there originally has been rejected. And the bad news today is that Trump has succeeded in grand theft wall once again. Yeah, there ought to be a video game of how, in order to build the southern border wall, Trump has committed grand theft from various Pentagon accounts. The latest diversion of some $3.8 billion comes from a fund that would have gone to buying National Guard equipment, fighter jets, combat aircraft, and ships. You know, the hardware of the military. And while it's fair to say there's a lot of fat in those budgets and a lot of pork that goes to the military-industrial complex, fundamentally, this is unconstitutional. And the Supreme Court issued a very vague ruling that essentially allowed this to continue until they get around to studying the problem in more depth. Meanwhile, last year, there was $4 or $5 billion from different funds that were diverted. And, of course, we were told Mexico is going to pay for it. Trump even continues to say that at some of his mob rallies. He's never really explicit. He's just, in the big picture, they're going to pay for it. And the crowd just cheers, and nobody asks for any further details. And given the failed impeachment and the kind of muscular attitude that Trump now has, that he can do anything and nobody can stop him, well, that ridiculous wall is apparently going to be built with stolen funds. The campaign by insider Democrats and their cronies in the media to stop Bernie Sanders is picking up new momentum as Ryan Grimm and Akela Lacey at The Intercept confirm that the super PAC called Democratic Majority for Israel, run by longtime AIPAC strategist Mark Mellman, which spent about $800,000 in Iowa on negative ads aimed at Sanders, is doing the same over in Nevada. But what The Intercept adds is that AIPAC is helping bankroll the anti-Sanders project by allowing donors to this super PAC, Democratic Majority for Israel, to claim credit for their support of AIPAC when they fund this dark money super PAC. And as you know, AIPAC doesn't contribute directly to campaigns, but they organize their members into different levels of support. And so if you give $100,000 to various candidates, you get rewards, benefits like access to members of Congress at private functions. And if you kick in $1 million, then you get even greater access. That's how their system works. And they're claiming this isn't direct coordination with the super PAC, and a spokesperson for the PAC said, as far as we know, what you are suggesting is completely untrue, but because we're a separate organization, we really don't know. And this week, Congresswoman Betty McCollum, who is a strong supporter of BDS, as I am, slammed AIPAC for trafficking in hate speech for a recent social media ad campaign that warned that radicals in Congress present a threat that may be more sinister than the Islamic State, complete with photos of the squad. Well, two squad members, Rashida Tlaib Ilhan Omar and Betty McCollum. Representatives of AIPAC spent Wednesday and Thursday on Capitol Hill apologizing for those ads, but I don't know that they have removed them. Now, in addition, over in Nevada, we've heard that Emily's List, the Democratic group that's supposed to promote women's candidates, has been preparing an attack ad on Sanders. And Mint Press News and reporter Alan McLeod report a new shadowy pack calling themselves the Beat Bernie 2020 movement. And they are asking for massive grassroots fundraising into a super PAC that will not reveal its donors. Why? Because the Bernie bros might get on Facebook and say mean things about them. And when you look at the transparency of the Sanders campaign, relying entirely on individual contributions that he says are averaging $18 this cycle, and then we see these efforts to take down Sanders with money and donors who are not disclosed. And what worries them is this latest poll from YouGov and The Economist shows Sanders nationally garnering 45%. So they are very worried, and as a front runner, he gets the most attention. Pleasantly surprised to see the Nobel Prize-winning economist Paul Krugman in the New York Times today kind of step back from his blind support of the Clinton wing of the Democratic Party. In his column today, his headline, Bernie Sanders isn't a socialist. A quote, "The thing is, Bernie Sanders isn't actually a socialist in any normal sense of the term. He doesn't want to nationalize our major industries, replace markets with central planning. He's expressed admiration not for Venezuela, but for Denmark. He's basically what Europeans would call a social democrat." And I agree. I agree with Krugman. And as you've heard me say before, Bernie needs to refine his statement about being a socialist and define it as the antidote to extreme capitalism and the way to fix the broad inequities in income and wealth in this country. Krugman even sticks his neck out here. If Sanders is indeed the nominee, the Democratic Party should give him its wholehearted support. How about that? Jonathan Turley didn't win any friends by being a witness for the Republicans in the Trump impeachment hearings. But I have great respect for him, and we can differ on certain issues. In his latest post, headline, Doomsday Scenario, Washington Moves to Crush the Sanders Revolution, he talks about the various efforts to demean and marginalize, talking about James Carville's comments, Chris Matthews' attacks on Sanders. And it was Chuck Todd who he said did the most shocking thing, comparing Sanders supporters to Nazi brown-shirted thugs, of course quoting somebody else to deliver the mudslinging. And Turley comments, the coverage of Sanders remains slanted and negative. His victory is only begrudgingly acknowledged by some, while immediately suggesting that he doesn't have a broad base of support. He says the fact is that voters like Sanders because he's viewed as authentic, something they do not associate with either the establishment in politics or the media. The one thing you can't say about Sanders is that he's a scripted, conventional politician who, like Biden and Clinton, has changed many positions with the poll. It has never been popular to hold socialist views, but Sanders has remained. You have to respect him for that, says Professor Turley. Every day I pause for a second when I remember to thank the people who support my work here at the Peter B. Collins Podcast with your subscriptions. And I want to thank Henry Garcica, who just mailed in a check to the P.O. Box, Suzanne Bowen, Faith Peoples, and Benny Alto. Each kick in 10, and Faith has multiple subscriptions. I can't tally how much she chips in every month. But they set a great example for you, and I hope you'll follow it. Visit peterbcollins.com, pull down the menu, click on Become a Subscriber. You'll hit the sign-up page, and it's easy to set up the account, the subscription that is comfortable for you. And if you want to use that P.O. Box, it's number 150660, San Rafael, California, 94915. Well, every day, new information is dribbling out about Mike Bloomberg and what his real positions are. You may have noticed he's not being interviewed on any of the TV news programs, even the safe ones, because he's buying TV time where he can control the message 100%. And so questions don't come up about, hey, Mayor Mike Bloomberg, what is your position on NSA surveillance of Americans in the United States? And going back to 2014, Katie Couric asked Mike Bloomberg, and he basically says, look, if you don't want it to be in the public domain, don't take that picture, don't write it down. In this day and age, you got to be pretty naive to believe that the NSA isn't listening to everything and reading every email. And incidentally, given how dangerous the world is, we should hope they are. Now, that's a year after Ed Snowden went public. And Mike Bloomberg went on to say that he uses the Nixon lesson. When you write something, you take a picture and somebody leaks it. How many times does that have to happen before you realize it's going to happen again and it could happen to you? He said, I call it the Richard Nixon lesson. Don't record it. I think we are trading our privacy and personal freedoms for convenience and pleasure. We always worry about the NSA, Bloomberg continued. Everything we're doing with every app is recorded, and those companies try to sell that info and profit from it. And then they say, oh, isn't it terrible that the NSA has been looking at you? Come on. They're doing the same thing themselves. And it's okay with Mike Bloomberg. And as you know, in New York, not only the stop and frisk policy, but the expansion of both publicly owned cameras and surveillance conducted by, for example, the bankers on Wall Street, all flow into the same control room. There are 3,000 smart surveillance cameras in Manhattan. It's called the Ring of Steel. And during Bloomberg's mayoral tenure, the NYPD used undercover informants to spy on Occupy Wall Street. They ran a years-long surveillance program of Muslims that crossed the river into New Jersey, where they didn't have the authority. They monitored numerous mosques, and they mapped so-called ancestries of interest. That's ethnic profiling. And Bloomberg, I got one more quote here. The people who are worried about privacy have a legitimate worry, but we live in a complex world where you're going to have a level of security greater than you did back in the olden days. And our laws and our interpretation of the Constitution, I think, have to change. Not only are our surveillance and privacy rights a risk with Mike Bloomberg, but he has a history of sex discrimination and sexual harassment lawsuits. 64 women have filed a total of 40 lawsuits over the past several decades. He's bragged about having a girlfriend in every city and how much fun it is to score with babes in New York City. And here comes a good commentary published at The Guardian a couple of days ago under the byline of Derica Purnell. And Derica is described as a social movement lawyer and writer based in Washington, D.C. And Purnell writes, Bloomberg must never become president. He and Trump are two sides of the same white supremacist billionaire coin. Heads for a national Muslim ban, tails for spying on thousands of Muslims in New Jersey and New York. Actually, Bloomberg is much more explicit in his intolerable views on people of color. We've talked about the redlining speech at Aspen. And also, let me take that back. The redlining speech may not have been at Aspen. She cites the Aspen comments where he said that 95% of murderers and murder victims fit one M.O. You can take the description, Xerox it, pass it out to all the cops. They are male, minorities, 16 to 25. That's true in New York. That's true in virtually every city. And that's where the real crime is. You've got to get the guns out of the hands of the people that are getting killed. You want to spend money on a lot of cops in the streets. Put the cops where the crime is, which means in minority neighborhoods. And some of the unintended consequences is people say, oh, my God, you're arresting kids for marijuana that are all minorities. Yes, that's true, he says. Why? Because we put all the cops in minority neighborhoods. And yes, that's true. But Purnell notes the facts. In New York State, while Bloomberg was governor, people reported for murder were 26% white, 44% black, and 29% unknown. 60% of the victims were black, more than 30% were white. They're not all the same. It does not all fit a single M.O. But Mike Bloomberg's not going to let anybody challenge him. It appears the only place he'll face contrary views is on the debate stage that he has purchased access to. My friend Stephen Zunis is a professor of politics and a Middle East specialist at the University of San Francisco. He identifies as a Warren supporter with Bernie as his second choice. And at Truth Out Today, he publishes an honest piece about Amy Klobuchar, who has long pushed for moving the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem, has promised not to reverse Trump's decision to do so. And he says, rejecting detailed reports from Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and other international organizations, she insists that Israel meets international standards for human rights. Indeed, she has referred to Israel as, quote, our beacon of democracy in the Mideast. One of her goals as president is to bring in American support again in a big way for Israel. Really? How could it be bigger than what Trump has done? Zunis continues, what differentiates her from the rest of the Democratic field was that Klobuchar was the only one of the original 6 senators running for president to support last year's Republican-sponsored Senate Bill 1, designed to support efforts by states to punish those who boycott Israel, Israeli settlements, the Israeli occupation, or companies supporting the occupation and settlements. 26 states have enacted such legislation. Sanders and Warren came out in opposition, and even pro-Israel senators like Gillibrand, Booker, and Harris thought the bill was too extreme and also voted no. And her embrace in the suppress of my right to support BDS is a huge violation of my First Amendment rights. And I want to take one more swipe at Klobuchar because I got to hear her same speech twice, once in Iowa, once in New Hampshire. And it's a great speech about her grandfather who was the iron ore miner in North Minnesota, her difficult upbringing with an alcoholic father. I noticed 2 things about it. One is she was talking about herself and not about what she's going to do for American voters. And number 2, she recited the same critiques of Donald Trump, which are not based on his crimes, they are based on his foibles. And so she has a list of stupid tweets that he's made, and the final one that always gets a laugh is how he attacked the Prime Minister of Canada, blaming Justin Trudeau for the fact that Trump got edited out of the Canadian version of Home Alone 2. Now, that is silly and it's amusing all at the same time. But she doesn't talk about his criminal lockup of children at the border in cages, his grand theft diversion of money from Pentagon budgets approved by Congress to pay for his stupid wall. She doesn't talk about his criminal use of the military and the way he puts us at risk by confronting Iran after breaching the 6-nation nuclear deal. She focuses on trivial matters related to Trump and not things that really affect Americans. And the latest trivial report on Trump comes from a new tell-all book called Sinking in the Swamp, How Trump's Minions and Misfits Poisoned Washington. And they tell the story that when Reince Priebus, who is from Wisconsin, the Badger State, was the White House chief of staff, that Trump would divert his attention from important issues to ask Reince Priebus about the little critter called the badger. It's a round, hairy omnivore. Most of us have never seen a badger and couldn't care less. But Trump appears to be obsessed by that. Well, I think his obsession with retribution against people who testified in the impeachment hearings, his effort to micromanage the Justice Department, that's much more critical than his curiosity about badgers. Front pager on today's Friday New York Times is an interesting look at U.S. relations with Iran over the last 9 months. And the focus of the article is appropriately on the potential for miscalculations that could lead to war. And it recites the history of the last 9 months, the Iranian, the accusation that Iran targeted tankers in the Persian Gulf. That still looks like propaganda to me. But even if you believe all of the, mainstream narratives about Iran over the past year, what is crucially missing from this recap is the recent discovery that's been published in the same New York Times that the intelligence that was used for the basis of taking out General Soleimani in a brazen assassination by drone was based on fake intelligence. That the Iraqi-American interpreter who was killed was not killed by an Iran-backed militia. His location was in an area where the Iranian-backed militias hadn't been seen since 2014. And it's now widely believed that the Islamic State was responsible for killing that American contractor. But the details don't matter, right? So now we're being told that we're very close to a deal with the Taliban that could allow U.S. forces to be fully withdrawn from Afghanistan. As you know, that's something I strongly support. We should end that military presence, and it's going to be ugly. In particular, the women who have enjoyed a respite from extreme Islamic rule are likely to face a huge wave of repression. But I don't believe that that is a rational reason to keep American troops there. And the U.S. knows that it can't get the Taliban to agree to a full ceasefire, so they use the phrase violence reduction. And they say that the U.S. is willing to come to terms as soon as they see 1 week of violence reduction by the Taliban. Only problem is, yesterday, an airstrike, which could only have been committed by the United States, killed 8 civilians in Afghanistan, just hours after the announcement that if they stop the violence, or at least trim it back, that we could have a deal. Do as I say, not as I do, and everything going to be fine. Meanwhile, those 500 or so remaining American troops in Syria who are supposed to watch the oil for Trump, they're in increasingly uncomfortable positions. And a U.S.-led convoy on Wednesday returned fire after it came under attack. One of their vehicles either got stuck in the mud or had a flat tire, and while they were addressing that, there were Syrian forces and apparently some Russians nearby, and also the local civilians want the American troops out of there too. And because they have no real mission, there are only 500 of them, it's really unconscionable that we still maintain a presence there, risking the lives of those troops who have no prospect of defending themselves. We still have air power coming in from Turkey. But it's a real dicey situation, and somebody's got to let up and allow Trump to do what he said he would do and get all U.S. troops out. This idea of leaving people there to watch the oil, it's just preposterous. And finally today, one more story that landed on the front page of the New York Times, spiking and promoting Russophobia, and noting that KCXL, an AM station near Kansas City, is now broadcasting programs produced by Sputnik, a Russian state media arm. Now, the New York Times uses the word Russian propaganda in the headline. In the first sentence, they say that you can hear Russian agitprop on the air in Kansas City. Then the next paragraph, Radio Sputnik, a propaganda arm of the Russian government. Well, keep in mind that John Kiriakou has a daily radio show on Radio Sputnik. And I know John well enough to know that this former CIA officer is no tool of Putin or the Russian government. And the Times fails to note the context, that Rush Limbaugh and all the right-wing ilk have 90 million listeners a day on AM talk radio. And here comes a little 1,000-watt station that gets paid $30 an hour to run Radio Sputnik. And the reason I raise this, too, is that I used to feed a program. In my other job as a radio show producer, I was the producer of a public radio program called Faith Matters, hosted by a Catholic nun. And KCXL was one of the stations that carried that show on Sunday morning. And so I want to give a shout out to Pete Chartel. He is the owner of the station there that has drawn the attention of the New York Times and the ire of some local people who are afraid of Russia. So, Pete, you're doing the right thing. And I'm glad that listeners in Kansas City can hear John Kiriakou's radio show if they want to. Thanks for listening to my daily news and comment podcast. You're free to share it all over the place. You'll find it on YouTube. And I'm still Peter B. Collins.
Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails to you. Keep smiling.